Hello and welcome to another Tattered Cover virtual event. My name is Adam. I am the director of events at Tattered Cover. For those of you who do not know, Tattered Cover is the largest independent bookstore in Colorado. We are based in Denver with 6 locations and we are expanding. So if you're in the Denver area, please check out all of our locations. We are opening Westminster. People who've been asking, we are opening it sooner rather than later. We'll have a date officially soon. If you need or want closed captioning, there is a black bar at the bottom of your screen that says CC. That is closed captioning for those who want or need it. So please click that. It is available for anyone who, again, needs or wants closed captioning. If you go to tattercover.com/event, you'll find more events like the one we're doing tonight. We're doing a bunch of virtual and some in person, but we do have a lot of virtual events forthcoming. So please, tatteredcover.com/events. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome the author of The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, Untold Stories of Women Who Changed the Course of World War II. I'm, of course, talking about Mary Kay Eder. Mary Kay Eder is a retired U.S. Army Major General and a renowned speaker and author and has and a thought leader on strategic communication and leadership. I am not really good at strategic communication. General Eder is a former commanding general of the U.S. Army Reserve Joint and Special Troops Support Command, a former deputy chief of Army Reserve, and former deputy chief of public affairs for the U.S. Army. General Eder is also the author of Leading the Narrative, the Case for Strategic Communication, which was published by the Naval Institute Press. Mary Kay Eder, please welcome. Join us on this virtual journey, and we will talk. You said I didn't have to say your entire bio, and now I wish I didn't because I stumbled over it. So I apologize, but welcome to Tattered Cover. Thank you for doing this with us.
Oh, it's great to be there. I wish I was there live and in person too.
Yeah, I think, on your next book, hopefully everyone has the pandemic under control and we'll be ready to do it. But the beautiful thing about Zoom is I'm in Denver, you're in Virginia. And we can do this. And we can talk about the girls who stepped out of line. I always start with, what is the book about? There's publicity copy. There's people who tell us what the book's about, but what is the book about in your eyes?
I started this, I think, as a way to tell stories that I kept finding. And many of the people in this book, there's 15 of them whose stories I tell. There are unknowns for the most part, who began to pass away around 2017 up through 2019. So I know how this sounds. I was collecting obituaries. As I would read one and think, what a great story. I need to do something with that someday. So I'm saving them. And it wasn't until I heard this presentation by Alex Borstein at the Emmys in 2019 that I thought, now I know what to do with these. And I know what unites these stories and brings them together. And it's life experiences. It's about belonging and risk, reward. And I think it's also about networking in many ways. So I found a way to bring together things that might seem different, disparate, but really have a lot in common.
Yeah, your book, the premise of it reminded me a lot of a baseball book called The Glory of Their Times, which was about baseball players from the golden age of baseball who were passing away, and we had to tell their story. As you were collecting these stories when did you realize, okay, I'm going to put it together in a book form and I'm going to make this something that the public can enjoy?
It took me a couple of years actually to get to the point where I had the light bulb go off and say, I really need to put these together. I talked about several of the women in the book at different leadership events and talked about what they'd been through, what example they set. But it didn't really hit me, like I said, until I saw that Emmy Awards presentation. Mm-hmm. So it was Alex Borstein who's receiving the Emmy for Best Supporting Actress from The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And she stood up and said, in World War II, my grandmother was about to be shot into a pit. She turned to the guard and said, well, what happens if I step out of line? And he said, well, I don't have the heart to shoot you, but somebody will. So she stepped out of line. And for that, I am here today. And for that, my children are here today. So step out of line, ladies, step out of line. And that was the moment of, yeah, I need to do this.
Wow, that just gave me goosebumps. I I think these stories are super important. Obviously, I think you do as well because you shared them. What was the most? What's one story that you can briefly? I know there's 15 of these women, but what's one highlight you can give us, and kind of that way you give us an appetizer of what's in the book.
Well, one that's been on my mind for the last couple of days is the story of Mary Taylorprevity. She was 9 years old, living in China with her parents and her two brothers and sister when the Japanese invaded. And they took all of the kids in the boarding school and locked them up. So by the time we get to 1945, she's been in a concentration camp for 5 years, from ages 9 to 12. So, and I'm thinking about this because today's the 18th of August. On the 15th was the 75th and 76th now anniversary of the victory over Japan, VJ Day. Mm-hmm. And on the 17th of August that year was when the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, sent in teams to these concentration camps to make sure the Japanese didn't kill the prisoners. Mm-hmm. So this 12-year-old girl sees a plane fly low and 6 American paratroopers jump out because they didn't know the war was over. They didn't know that they were free. So it's her learning that she's now free after 5 years. And it took a few weeks before they were able to get the kids back to their parents in China. And then they moved back to the US a year later. She grows up to become an English teacher, then on the school board, then in the state. And she ends up being the administrator and running a juvenile detention center. Who better to understand what kids go through in incarceration than somebody who's spent basically half their childhood in a concentration camp?
Mm-hmm. And there's so many stories like this that are just stories that I feel like the general public hasn't heard before. Like nobody's made a movie about this person, and that's usually where people find out.
There could be a movie about every one of them.
Exactly, that's what I'm getting at. When you started collecting these stories, what was your approach? Was it just let's have a conversation, or how did you find all these, and what was your approach to collecting them?
A lot of them just seemed to come to me because many of the people in this book did pass away in 2019. A few I had seen earlier. One of them was the story of the 2 British sisters who saved 26 Jewish families, helping them escape from Germany in the 1930s as the Nazis were taking over. And they were public servants. They worked for the government there in London. And where did they get the money to do this? Mm-hmm. One of them, their name was Ida Cook, and she wrote under the name of Mary Burchell. I don't know if you can see this, but she wrote mysteries and romance. She wrote 112 romance books from 1930 to something like 1975. So this one is a Harlequin romance, mm-hmm. and it cost 75 cents new, but I found it on eBay for, well, a little more than that a few weeks ago.
Yeah, wow.
And when this was printed, they said they reprinted it because her biography was supposed to come out. So her biography came out in 1976 and was reissued in 1980. So I'm finding their stories they wrote themselves. A lot of them wrote autobiographies right after the end of the war that are now long out of print and hard to find. I found a lot of them trying to do research on eBay because most places I went to talk to people were closed due to the pandemic. So nobody answered me from the Holocaust Museum or the National Archives or various libraries, but you can find anything online and buy it.
Yeah. Do you feel that they didn't? Why do you think they didn't get back? Just because of the pandemic? Do you? Maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth or their mouth, but maybe they thought that these women's stories weren't important enough to get back to a right.
I think there were people not in the office.
Sure. Okay.
They were at home, or there were a few who did answer me, and I'd say, do you think you can go into the library and help me find this photograph? No, we can't go in.
Okay.
So they couldn't help me if they wanted to.
Sure.
So some of them I had to wait months The hunt for the photos to go with some of these stories was just as interesting as some of the research.
Sure. And so a majority of it was during the pandemic, then when you were putting it together as the book, right? Then, yeah. How did that, and this is something I haven't talked about in a while with someone who wrote a book. How was it writing during a pandemic? What was it easy? Was it an escape? What was it like for you?
It focused me. Certainly I had from January of last year until the 1st of May to finish the manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started, I had only written one chapter. So I needed to totally focus.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would ever recommend to anyone doing research and writing at the same time concurrently. Mm-hmm. But that was what I ended up having to do to make sure I had all of the information I needed. So I'm doing both at the same time. So I made a lot of mistakes that way. I really did. And I had to go back and fix them during the succession of edits that you typically go through with preparing a book. And I was glad I was able to do that because I wanted to do right by them and telling their stories.
And then this book came out, a few weeks ago. You've had a long storied career. Before we were on the call, or before we were live with the audience, we talked about, you've written journalistically before writing long form nonfiction. I want to go back further in your timeline to your military career, to your Army career. That's something that super interests me. Maybe people out there have already heard it, but we won't spend too much time on it. Why did you follow the path that you followed?
Certainly what I wanted to do going into the Army was to end up in the area where there was journalism, public relations, journalism, to write about, to do stories about, and to do media relations about what was going on with the Army and its missions. I wasn't successful in finding that at first. It took me a few years to learn enough about the Army itself to get to the place where I went, aha, there it is. Now I know how to get into this field and how to do it.
Mm-hmm. So telling stories and about the Army and military, that was always on your mind then?
Telling stories that were interesting, diverse, international, had some excitement to them, some adventure, some, I think, difficulty at times, or some controversy. Certainly, I've done enough of that too. So it's finding the balance and finding what appeals, finding how to tell it factually and truthfully and help get it out there.
Mm-hmm. And you served for decades. If my research is correct, 1977 to 2012 is when you served.
Right.
When you retire from the Army in the early, or a decade-ish ago, what's your, you're retired, but now you've written books, this book, obviously. What was your plan for your retirement? Did you keep it? What did you want to do?
I did not want to become a bureaucrat. I did not want to become a contractor. I wanted to pursue what had been my childhood dream and write fiction. So yes, I have done that. Yes, I probably need to do a lot of work on that and redo it. But it was the transition from writing in a expository style or then a journalistic style to then something entirely different. So there were things I had to relearn, and you have to start at the absolute bottom to relearn. I went to a conference and they had a session on grammar, and I thought, I don't need that. Well, yes, I did. So it was it's a learning experience, and one that's humbling at the same time, with how you need to make yourself start over. So it was a childhood dream to write fiction. Mm-hmm. So it was going back to, I've always wanted to do this and I'm going to do it. I gave myself 5 years to be successful. Well, it took a little longer than that to actually get to where I could write something that would be cohesive and make sense and be appealing, I think, and that others would want to read and could understand.
Mm-hmm. And so you spend the years writing, and you had multiple books come out, and now we're here. And you made a clip about the struggles of writing, and then you talked about grammar just then. How was it? So you talked about research and writing at the same time. but writing this book, what did you learn about yourself or about writing in general when you wrote, The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line?
One of the things I learned was that I found a lot of the original stories about some of these people were incorrect in many ways. So I wanted to correct the record and tell it the right way. And in some of these cases, enough of my background was helpful in helping me to go, oh, that isn't right. That can't be true. No. So I mentioned to you Mary Taylor. So what she ate in that concentration camp was scraps, that the Japanese army gave them. They had to eat pulverized eggshells, which she pronounced as vile. But they also had to eat what one of the stories about her called fried animal brains. And I thought, oh, that is not right. That can't be. So I did enough research to realize it was a typo. And it had been repeated and repeated and repeated. And other stories, it was fried animal grain, which is sorghum that you feed to cattle or pigs. So I was like, oh, well, that makes more sense. So I found a lot of things like that were just typos or incorrect or, just outright fabrications that then get repeated over and over. And when you go back to, as historians keep telling me, to the original documents, then you can find out what really occurred.
Yeah, I find that idea of someone's story to be cemented in history, but be completely wrong because of a typo. Did you find more examples of that as you dug through these 15 women's stories?
I did. I found a lot of it with people who write stories about the military, who've not been in the military, will take abbreviations and make them have other meanings or talk about things that are just incorrect. One of the women in the book was an Army nurse in a heavy combat hospital, heavy casualty. And so they had to put up their tent every 10 days, take them down. There were multiple tents, and move and move and move, following the combat units as they move forward. She landed at not on D-Day, but 2 weeks later in Normandy with her unit, and they traveled across Europe all the way to the end of the war. And when the war ended, for most of us, our understanding of it just stops right there with that day. Mm-hmm. People were there for months before they were able to come home. And the hospital units were on standby. They weren't allowed to relax. They didn't get to stand down. They were on call in case they had to go to Japan. So there was definitely a little bit of a morale issue with that. But I've had enough experience with those tents to know that it is not easy to put them up. Mm-hmm. You need 15 or so people to get one of those larger tents up, and they would have to put them up first to do triage and then to do surgery. Mm. So I can imagine, and you're being shelled, and there's people shooting, and there's planes overhead, and it's just a very difficult situation. And to do this over and over and over, I can imagine how stressful that was. But when you read about it and it says, yes, they put the tents up and took them down, it's like, well, it's a lot more than that.
Yeah, and that's why these stories are so fascinating. You spent the past few years writing them, and now the book is out. This is other than knowing the 15 women, knowing these stories, what do you hope readers take away when they finish The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line? I hope they take away a sense of how important it is to have belonging, whether it's belonging to a group, being accepted in a new country, in a new home, in a new place, being part of a organization that's achieving, how important it is to have mentors and friends and colleagues to support you going forward, how what they did is not far away and in the past. For many people, I think when they think about World War II, it's back there with the pyramids, it's way far away. Mm-hmm. But it's not, it's yesterday. And what they did so informs and influences where we are now. Even if some of the things, it seems like, well,
there was a lesson there with what these people accomplished, but now we have to learn it all over again.
Yeah. And I'm just looking at, I just always have like I have your website up, and we talked about the things that interest you, communications, these women. You also wrote, and we touched upon it, but one of the best titles I've ever seen in my life, 1001 Places to Pee Before You Die. I know this is a jarring switch of conversation, but I had to compliment you before I forgot.
Sure.
Yeah, so that, and so you've written these Benson books, and then I've seen your dog before. That's not the dog. That's not the Benson, was it?
Right.
That I meant?
Right.
And
yeah,
and
he
so,
couldn't read very well. He thought that's what the book said. So, and that was a stress relief writing those stories.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I wanted to get at. So you have these communication books that are like really tactile and for people in that field. You have these fun books. You have this very informative book for the general public. Where do you go next? Do you want to keep writing? What interests you?
Well, there's a couple other World War II stories I want to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the fiction, which is mystery thriller stuff. Mm-hmm. But the publisher who I had for the communications book, they said, you have these other two books that are dog stories. And what do you want to do next? And I said, something totally different. And they said, oh, no, you can't have two of these and one of those and some of them. And I said, why not?
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
So you'll continue exploring all these different interests. We have a question from Catherine about research. You talked about researching while writing. With your next World War II stories, do you feel you're going to research, and then write, or what's your path forward on that front?
For the next one, I have done all the research, and for me, it has been at least initially, not an understanding of how to put it together, which I think doing this has helped me to come to yes, I can do this and put it together, and I would do it in this manner. So I think I'm ready for it now.
And these World War II stories, without saying much about it, are they in the same vein of they're pretty much largely untold, or are they more familiar stories we might know just with a new angle and new research?
It's an absolutely unknown story. Mm-hmm. And it's major. It's a huge story. So, and I'll give you just a little bit about it. It's about a Russian general who was captured by the Germans. And then he turned on Russia and decided to fight for Hitler. And he was given permission to build an army. So in the middle of 1944, he's recruiting Russian POWs to fight in this army at the rate of 55,000 a day. Wow. So at the beginning of 1945, he had almost 1 million men in this army. So then it's what happens to it, what happens to him, what happens to the Americans who find him and capture him.
And Kelly asks, you mentioned that these women's stories came to you. And then I'm kind of modifying her question. Did this story come to you, or how do you find these stories that are so unknown but so important?
This one came to me. The one I want to write next was kind of an accident. I knew someone who had a neighbor whose father was working in a POW camp at the end of the war. And so we talked, and he told me a little bit about it. I went and researched it and found everything he told me was wrong, but the real story was even better.
It's so fascinating to me. And as someone who's in the writing world, who doesn't necessarily write, just that the way writers, the way people like you find stories is just so fascinating, almost as much as the stories themselves, because there's just so many stories to tell out there.
Well, it's also how you make it approachable. I think the stories in this book are written in a style that's meant to make it approachable for those who would say, oh, I don't want to read history. I'd rather read the 112 romance books, or I'd rather read mystery or thrillers. So this is written in a way, I think, to make these people be real and be now. So it's very conversational style. So it brings them alive to you.
Mm-hmm. As you've written and developed your writing career now, your post, Army career, how have you changed as a writer from the early days of you writing outside of the Army and outside of public relations to now?
Well, I think I am much more critical of myself, and I can edit myself better. I can write creatively in the afternoon, but then in the morning, the editor takes over and tears it apart, which you need both sides of the brain to do that. And before, I was very sensitive about what I had written, and no, I don't want anyone to touch it. And now I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I feel I used to write, or I still do, but I write for like literary outlets, etc. And I'm so self-conscious once my editor gets it, because I'm like, it's like, wow, I criticize myself for missing it, or not seeing everything. But that's important to realize, like, oh, you have to self-edit, but then there's someone else. There's always someone else who's going
Right.
to touch whatever your work is.
I'm the person who, when I was in Germany, spelled my own name wrong in my signature block on my emails and left it that way for months and didn't realize it. So
that's something I would do for sure. We already talked about what's next. I want to wrap up with just, what advice can you give writers? We talked about editing and everything, but what do you wish you knew? I mean, even back when you were in the Army doing that part of your career, what do you wish you knew then that you know now?
I wish I had written something every day, because you only get better at it the more you practice it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like I mentioned, going to the class and learning grammar again.
Yeah.
So you will have to relearn some of that if you don't use it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, if you're a runner and you don't lift weights, you're going to hurt when you go back to doing a more complete or a different kind of a workout. So it's the same thing. If I haven't exercised the ability to write in a conversational tone, then I'm going to have to relearn that. So for each chapter I wrote in here, I would gather all the research, put it down, and then I'd go walk the dogs and think about, how am I going to start this one? How am I going to begin it? How am I going to pull you in as a reader so you want to know what happened? What is the most interesting way I can do this? And for some of them, it was back at the beginning of their career. Some of them, it was years later. Some of them, it was somewhere in the middle at a critical point. So I would find a way to start. And from finding the start, everything else came together.
Writing every day, that is something that's always great advice. And I feel like nobody says it enough, that it's writing is an art form, but it's a practice. It's something that you need to work it out.
Yes, it's just as bad as the piano or something like that.
Well, Mary Kay Eder, Major General Mary Kay Eder, thank you so much for joining Tattered Cover virtually from Virginia. And I know your dog is there. We were hanging out earlier, so you can go play with your dog. But where can we find you on the internet? What's the best way to connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm not on Instagram because I don't like it. But so I'm on the others, but you can find me that way. Or I do have a website now, and I have a newsletter. The newsletter actually is letting me do a little more research now that I have more time and add to some of these stories. So I can talk a little bit about romance books and who's writing them, and I'll do that in the next newsletter.
Perfect. And we'll link that to all the readers out there. You can find us at tatteredcover.com. This YouTube link will be emailed out a few days later for all the viewers out there, for you to share. Please get The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, which is a super important book. Mary Kay Eder, thank you so much. I hope you have a great evening out there in Virginia.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cool.